got murdered. What was your reaction to that?
I was shocked. I started crying. I mean, it stunned me. I didn't know how it could happen. I don't know why it would happen.
That's exactly how 17-year-old Jeff reacted when he discovered that 4 members of his family were brutally murdered on the night of his prom. But surprisingly, that same Jeff would be found guilty 17 years after that interview. This case is one of those that'll have you second-guessing everything. Seriously, everything. From the cops to the detectives, the prosecution team, and even the judge. To this day, many people still can't believe he's guilty, and by the time you finish this video, you might just be left asking the same question that's haunted everyone who's followed this story. What really happened? To figure out whether Jeff was guilty or not, let's first understand his background and family. For that, we're heading to Lakeville, Indiana, a tiny town with fewer than 900 people. Jeff and his family weren't ordinary folks in this town. They were well known and played a significant role in the community. But Jeff and his family didn't start their story there. Jeff, whose full name is Robert Jeffrey Pelley, was born on December 10, 1971, in Florence, Kentucky, to his parents Robert and Eva Pelley. As his name suggests, Jeff was named after his father. A few years later, Jeff became an older brother when the family welcomed a second child, a daughter named Jacques. In 1980, when Jeff was 9 years old, the Pelley family packed their bags and moved to Cape Coral, Florida. The reason for the move was a new job opportunity for Bob, Jeff's father, who had secured a position in computer programming at Landmark Bank. Now, Jeff and Jacques were raised in a religious household where going to church was a non-negotiable part of life. Bob, their father, was deeply committed to his faith and strict when it came to discipline. Crying wasn't allowed, as Bob believed it was a sign of weakness, a lesson he carried over from his own upbringing. However, the kids found comfort in their mother, Eva, who provided them with a space to show their emotions. But life took a heartbreaking turn in February 1985 when Eva passed away from skin cancer. She had refused treatment and her health rapidly declined, eventually leaving her in a coma. For Jeff and Jacques, losing their mother was devastating and their family's dynamic was forever changed. This was evident just a few months after Eva's death when Bob met a 27-year-old woman named Dawn Huber. Dawn had also experienced loss, having recently lost her significant other. The two were introduced through Bob's cousin, Katie, who was also Dawn's best friend. Their connection was quick, and within 9 months of Eva's passing, Bob and Dawn married in a small church ceremony in Ohio. However, this union wasn't exactly a happy occasion for everyone. Jeff and Jacques weren't even invited to the wedding, although Dawn's 3 daughters, 5-year-old Jessica, 4-year-old Janelle, and 2-year-old Jolene, were present. By 1986, the newly blended family made a fresh start in the tiny town of Lakeville, Indiana. Bob believed he had been called to ministry and accepted a position at the Olive Branch United Brethren Church. This was no mega church. It was a humble congregation of just 40 to 50 members. The job offered a modest salary of $1,300 a month, which, when adjusted for inflation, would be about $3,700 to $4,000 per month in today's money. What made the deal sweeter was the free housing, a parsonage provided by the church, situated conveniently right across the street. After moving, Jeff began attending LaVille Junior-Senior High School, where he quickly became well-liked by his peers. He also got a part-time job at McDonald's, further cementing his place in the community. Around this time, he started dating a girl named Darla, and from the outside, it seemed like life was finally settling down for the Pelleys in their new town. However, just like any true crime story, life has also a way of taking a shocking turn when you least expect it. A few years later, something unimaginable happened that would forever change the Pelley family's story. On Sunday, April 30th, 1989, Dave, a member of the Olive Branch United Brethren Church, was responsible for making sure everyone showed up for the service on time. At around 9:15 in the morning, he noticed something unusual. Pastor Bob and his family were nowhere to be found. Bob, who ran the church, was always there before 9. This was highly out of character for him. Around the same time, an 11-year-old girl named Stephanie, who was friends with the Pelley children, went over to the family's parsonage. This was a regular Sunday routine for her, but when she got to the back door of the garage, she was surprised to find it locked. Thinking something was odd, she tried the sliding glass door at the back, but that was locked too. Confused, Stephanie ran back to the church, thinking she had simply missed them. She told her father, Henry, about what happened, and together with Dave, they started wondering if the Pelley family might have just overslept. By 9:30, Dave asked a young church member to step in and lead the service while he tried to figure out where Pastor Bob was. He walked over to the Pelley's parsonage and knocked on both the front and back doors, but there was no answer. All the blinds were drawn and the curtains were shut tight, leaving Dave unable to see anything inside. Feeling uneasy, he returned to the church and sat in the back row, but something didn't sit right with him. Minutes later, he and another church member decided to try a spare key to gain access to the house. Unfortunately, the key didn't fit. Just then, Lydia Easterday, another church member, saw them struggling and offered them another key, one belonging to her husband, a staff member of the church. Dave tried the back door first, but it didn't work. He then moved to the front door, and to his relief, the key turned. And what he saw in that hallway would haunt him forever. The first thing he noticed was Bob's eyeglasses lying on the carpet. As he stepped closer to the glasses, he looked to his left and froze. There, on the floor, was Bob, face down in a pool of blood. Panic set in. Dave rushed to the back door, letting the other church members inside. He told them to call 911 immediately. As he continued to survey the house, he spotted the stairs leading down to the basement. He peered down and saw 2 small feet clad in white socks. His heart sank. He knew it was one of the children. The dim lighting made it hard to see, but the unmistakable feeling of dread overtook him. Soon, paramedics arrived. Dave quickly told them not to touch anything as he suspected a murder had taken place. They turned on the light, and the scene would soon reveal a chilling truth.
The Sunday after prom night in April 1989, parishioners with Lakeville's Olive Branch Church found their minister and his family dead on the floor of the church parsonage. Reverend Robert Pelley was found with 2 bullet holes in his body. His wife, Dawn, was found entwined with the bodies of her 2 young daughters, Janelle, 8, and Jolene, 6.
This tragedy was truly horrific, and as you might recall, there were 7 members of the Pelley family, so with 4 of them found dead, the search for the remaining 3 children was on. It turns out, though, that 3 of the children weren't even home that morning. Jessica, the 9-year-old daughter of Dawn, had spent the night at a friend's house. When her friend's mother drove her back to the parsonage that morning, they arrived to see yellow caution tape surrounding their home. Jessica immediately sensed something was terribly wrong, and her worst fears were confirmed when she learned what had happened to her family. But there was still the question of where Pastor Bob's other 2 children were. Jacques, aged 14, was about an hour and a half away at Huntington College, visiting friends from a church camp. The situation surrounding Jacques' return was strange. A bishop from their church came to pick her up, but he didn't tell her anything about the tragedy that had just unfolded at home. Jacques was completely blindsided when she arrived home and learned of the devastating news. Jeff, the 17-year-old son of Pastor Bob, was also nowhere to be found. Detectives later learned he had been at Six Flags Great America, a theme park in Gurnee, Illinois. They pieced this together from Jessica, who mentioned it during the investigation. Now, tracking Jeff down wasn't as difficult as it seemed, though. He and his girlfriend, Darla, along with a group of friends, had spent the day at the park. While standing in line for a ride, Jeff started to feel something wasn't quite right. It was a nagging sensation, one that he couldn't explain, but he couldn't shake it. He turned to Darla and confided in her, saying he thought something bad had happened. though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Darla tried to dismiss his concerns, but Jeff's uneasy feeling only grew stronger. Before long, the police arrived at Six Flags, and they separated Jeff and Darla from their friends. They began to interview everyone about Jeff's whereabouts the night before, trying to piece together his movements. Jeff was interrogated right after this with his grandparents, and there's actually a clip of him being questioned.
Was there anybody in the family you really didn't get along with? How about your stepmother?
We didn't get along real well. I mean, we talked hi, bye type thing, but we never really talked to each other or anything. I mean, I didn't hate her or anything, but we tolerated each other.
And how about your stepsisters?
Which ones? All three of them? What about them?
Did you get along with them?
Oh, I get along with the girls great. I just love the girls.
Did you and your dad get in any arguments Saturday?
No, we had a real good day Saturday. We got along real well.
What do you mean you and your dad had a real good day?
Saturday we didn't argue at all. He was really, he said that I'd been doing a pretty good job of shaping up and everything.
So do you know who killed your mother and father? Or your father and...
No, I really don't. I don't know who would want to.
Did you have anything to do with it?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. Me and my father didn't get along sometimes. Sometimes I'd be really upset with him. But we always worked things out.
As you can tell from the clip, the tension in the air was palpable. Right from the start, the police were cautious around Jeff, and their suspicion was undeniable. It was clear to them that something wasn't adding up, and they began to focus their attention on him. The reason for their suspicion? According to the investigators, Jeff's relationship with his family was anything but simple. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. As it turns out, when Bob and Dawn married, Bob had hoped that Jeff and Jacques, his children from his first marriage, would accept Dawn as their new mother. But that was a lot to ask, especially since their real mother had passed away less than a year earlier. For Jeff and Jacques, moving on from their mother was impossible. They couldn't just forget her, and that resistance created a rift in the family that would only deepen over time. To make matters worse, Jeff and Jacques didn't agree with the way Dawn was raising her daughters. The differences in parenting styles caused friction at home, and Jeff, in particular, was growing more distant from his father and the new family dynamics. According to their neighbors, Jeff had become something of an outcast within his own family. He didn't fit in, and it seemed like he was always on the outside looking in. But that wasn't all. 6 weeks before the tragic events, Jeff found himself in serious trouble. He was arrested for stealing CDs and cash from a neighbor named John. The crime itself was bad enough, but the aftermath was even more telling. John chose not to press charges, but instead they worked out a deal. This, however, didn't sit well with Bob. His anger was palpable, and as a form of punishment, Bob decided that Jeff wouldn't be allowed to attend prom. That was a big deal for a 17-year-old, and it was a blow to Jeff's social life. Bob didn't stop there. He openly shared Jeff's behavior problems with others at church, further isolating Jeff from the rest of the community. It was clear that Bob was frustrated with his son, and this tension only seemed to escalate. To add insult to injury, Bob even took matters into his own hands by removing some of Jeff's belongings from his car, including his car keys. The car in question was a 1984 silver Ford Mustang, a flashy, attention-grabbing vehicle that was hard to miss. By taking the keys, Bob essentially grounded Jeff, restricting his freedom even more. With all these factors at play, the police's suspicion of Jeff only grew stronger. They couldn't help but wonder if his frustration and anger had led him to do something unforgivable. And after that tense interview, they began to focus their attention entirely on him, trying to find any clue that would tie him to the crime. But here's where things start to get tricky. There are a lot of discrepancies and oddities in this case that really make you question whether Jeff was actually involved. Let's start with the first major contradiction. Jeff wasn't originally allowed to attend prom, a decision Bob had made as punishment for his previous transgressions. But then, surprisingly, Bob had a change of heart and allowed Jeff to go. According to both Jeff and his sister Jock, Bob could be harsh when doling out punishments. However, once Bob had cooled down, he would often reduce the severity of his punishments, and this instance was no different. Jeff's prom night was not a typical rebellious teenager's outing, though, and that's where things began to get murky. At the crime scene, detectives discovered some curious items. Among the usual evidence, things like carpet fibers, walls, and bullet fragments, was something far more intriguing. A set of keys was found in a trash barrel outside the house, but it wasn't just any set of keys. Attached to them was a heart-shaped locket, and inside the locket was a photo of a man and a woman. Strangely, the investigators paid little attention to this, and they didn't even photograph the item for evidence. What could this locket mean? Who were the people in the photo? These questions were left unanswered, adding to the growing list of oddities. Other peculiarities emerged as well. On Jeff's bed, they discovered a photo book filled with pictures of his life from the first 7 years. At first, this seemed like a normal childhood album, but as time went on, it became an odd clue. It was as though Jeff had been looking back on his early memories, particularly when his mom was still alive and his dad wasn't remarried. Could this have stirred up intense emotions that led to the violence? The police also found a load of laundry in the house, freshly washed that same day, and it only contained Jeff's clothes. This raised suspicions. Was Jeff trying to cover up something? Some speculated that he might have been revisiting his memories when he lost control, perhaps in a fit of rage, and murdered his family before quickly cleaning up. But there was something much more puzzling that wasn't found at the crime scene. Despite the brutal killings, there was no sign of the weapon that caused all the destruction. There was no 20-gauge shotgun, no shell casings, and no indication of where the weapon had gone. The Pelley family had indeed owned a Mossberg 520-gauge shotgun, which Bob had purchased in December 1987. Bob traded a .44 caliber handgun and $90 to acquire the gun, which he had planned to give Jeff as a Christmas gift. But by the time the authorities arrived at the scene, the shotgun was missing. Even more strange was the fact that it wasn't included in the list of evidence, and no one could explain where it had gone. Keep this in mind, because this missing gun would become a key detail in the mystery later on. And to understand the timeline better, let's rewind to the day before the murders, on April 29, 1989. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Jeff worked a morning shift at McDonald's, and later that day, his father, Bob, stopped by a gun store owned by Steve Diller. Bob didn't buy anything, but he spent some time talking with the owner. Afterward, he picked Jeff up from work, and they headed home to the parsonage. It was well known that Bob had recently picked up a hobby, photography. On that particular day, he had scheduled a photo session with several couples, a task he was excited about. Eyewitness accounts would later place Bob at the parsonage before the tragic events unfolded. The window of time in which the family was likely killed was incredibly short, only about 15 minutes, between 5:10 and 5:25 in the evening. A couple, Kim and David, were some of the last people to see the family alive. They had just finished taking photos with Bob and were leaving the house around 5 o'clock. Another man, Matt Mueller, drove by the parsonage at 5:15 and noticed Jeff's Mustang still parked in the driveway. However, when Kim and David passed by again at 5:30, the scene had dramatically changed. Jeff's car was gone, and the family was nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, another couple, Crystal and her date, had a scheduled photo session with Bob and his daughters at Crystal's house. But when Bob and the girls didn't show up at the agreed time, Crystal grew concerned. She decided to go over to the parsonage herself. When she arrived with her date, they knocked on the doors, but no one answered. All the cars were parked in the driveway, except for Jeff's Mustang, which was missing. Based on these accounts, it seemed clear that Jeff's car was gone by 5:30 p.m., which would have been after the murders had occurred. However, some eyewitness accounts didn't quite match up. Kurt Schaefer, a friend of Jeff's, and his cousin Ken saw Jeff leave the parsonage between 4:45 and 5 o'clock. Kurt even recognized the distinct sound of Jeff's Mustang. Lewis, another neighbor, also saw Bob around 5 o'clock, talking to a man in a black pickup truck. Bob was holding a shovel, and although Lewis waved at him, he seemed distracted. Who was this man in the black truck? No one knew. But perhaps the most crucial sighting came from Dennis, a gas station clerk. Dennis was working at an Amoco station just 6 minutes from the parsonage. At 5:17 in the evening, he saw Jeff pull in with his Mustang. Jeff was under the hood of his car, wearing a black Hawaiian shirt and blue jeans. Dennis remembered the time clearly because his shift was supposed to end at 5, but his replacement was late. At 5:20, Jeff entered the store and used the phone to call his girlfriend, Darla. He told her his car was idling too high and that he was running late. After the call, Jeff returned outside to continue working on the car. By 5:37, Jeff left the gas station and Dennis clocked out for the day. From these accounts, if the Pelley family was indeed murdered between 5:10 and 5:25 p.m., it seemed clear that Jeff had no involvement. Moving on, Jeff later went to his friend Lynette Greer's house around 5:45 p.m., a visit confirmed by his girlfriend Darla. The two, along with Lynette and her date, went to the Emporium restaurant at 6:15 p.m. to meet more friends. At the restaurant, everyone said Jeff appeared perfectly normal, chatting, laughing, and enjoying the evening like any teenager. Later that night, Jeff attended prom and afterward went bowling. Witnesses at both events described him as calm and collected, seemingly unaffected by the horrific events that had occurred just hours before, if he were indeed involved. He spent the night at a friend's house and went to Six Flags the next morning, carrying on as though nothing had happened. The police questioned everyone who had been with him that day, but no evidence connected him to the murders. His whereabouts were accounted for, and no clues tied him to the crime. As a result, the case went cold, and attention shifted away from Jeff. Over the years, the surviving children, including Jeff, grew up. He and his girlfriend went off to college, while his sisters went to live with their grandparents and in foster care. Unfortunately, Jeff's relationship didn't work out, and he eventually moved back to Lakeville. However, his return to his hometown was anything but easy. Since the murders, most people still viewed him with suspicion, pointing fingers at him as the prime suspect. The constant whispers and judgment weighed heavily on him, and as a result, Jeff decided to leave Lakeville behind for a fresh start. Seeking a new beginning, Jeff relocated to Fort Myers, Florida, where he started working in the credit bureau business owned by a longtime family friend, Philip Hawley. The Hawley family welcomed him as one of their own, and Jeff eventually married Philip's niece, Kim. It seemed like life was moving forward for Jeff, and for a while, things appeared to settle down. However, the shadow of the past was never far behind. Years after the tragic deaths of his family, Jeff and his sisters were each left inheritance money from their parents' estate. Jeff was set to inherit $48,000, while his sisters would receive $65,000 each. But there was a catch. They couldn't access the funds until they turned 23. Desperate for the money, Jeff became fixated on getting his hands on it sooner, and he came up with a plan. He told a story about having skin cancer and needing surgery. To make it seem real, he even forged medical papers. But his plan didn't work. The names on the documents didn't match the hospital staff, and it became clear he was lying. The FBI, who had been investigating the Pelley family case, got involved. They tracked Jeff down for trying to deceive them. In the end, Jeff was charged with wire fraud. He didn't go to prison, but he was sentenced to probation. The charge was a lighter one, but it still made his reputation even worse. After all the trouble with the fraud charges, Jeff shifted his focus to something else: computers. He managed to land a job as an international consultant for the well-known company, IBM. Things seemed to take a turn for the better. He and his wife, Kim, had a son and moved to Dade City, Florida. They bought a beautiful house that was worth around $500,000. For a while, it seemed like Jeff was finally rebuilding his life. However, things weren't as perfect as they appeared on the surface. In 1997, Jeff and Kim filed for divorce, though they later reconciled and got back together. Despite all this, the shadow of the Pelley family murders still followed Jeff wherever he went, leaving him with a tarnished reputation that wouldn't go away. By the year 2000, the county prosecutor in Lakeville had changed. A new prosecutor named Chris Toth took over. He was determined to reopen cold cases, hoping to bring justice to victims like the Pelley family. He put together a fresh team of investigators and assigned Detective Craig Whitfield to take charge of the case. Craig's first step was to track down Jeff's two surviving sisters, Jack and Jessica. Jessica, the only surviving child of Dawn, who now goes by the name Jessie, had been disconnected from the rest of the family for years. She had spent a lot of time in foster care and struggled with substance abuse. By the time Craig interviewed her, Jessie had 2 children of her own, and she wasn't really in touch with her siblings anymore. During their conversation, Jessie revealed something shocking. She had once believed her father, Bob, was responsible for the murders. But as she got older, she found out that Jeff was actually being looked at as the prime suspect. Jessie remembered an unsettling conversation she had with Jeff when she was just 15 years old, 6 years after the murders. Jeff invited her to visit him and his new wife in Florida, and while she was there, he asked her, "Who do you think did it?" Jessie, still thinking it was their father, replied, "Your dad." To her surprise, Jeff simply said, "Okay." At the time, Jessie didn't think much of it, but looking back, she realized that Jeff might have asked that question because he was worried she might suspect him. After that, Craig interviewed Jacques, but she came with a lawyer by her side, worried that her words might be twisted or misinterpreted. Jacques was becoming more convinced that Jeff was the only possible suspect. The detectives were desperate to find solid proof to link him to the murders, so they started focusing on the laundry found at the crime scene. According to Craig Whitfield, the lead investigator on the case, he explained that a dark and pink striped shirt, a pair of blue jeans, and 2 white socks were found packed inside an Annis Finer Foods bag. Inside one of the pockets of the jeans, the FBI discovered 34 coins and $1, which added up to a total of $1.50, along with a receipt from Anna's grocery store. Craig believed that the jeans being found in the washer was suspicious and could be probable cause to arrest Jeff. He thought that Jeff had likely left the money and receipt in the jeans because he was distracted and in a rush to take them off, forgetting they were there. However, a pair of blue jeans was never found in the washing machine, only a shirt and socks. In fact, not a single detective or officer involved in the case ever said they personally handled a pair of blue jeans. Jeff was wearing blue jeans when he went to Lynette's house before prom, so it was strange that they weren't found. Another issue raised was that no officer ever went to Anna's grocery to confirm whether Jeff had been there. No one came forward to say they had personally seen him there. It seemed likely that the jeans were never washed and were not found in the washing machine with the shirt and socks. Instead, Jeff's clothes that were found in the back of his Mustang, including a Hawaiian shirt, may have been mixed with the other evidence. Craig then wrote up a probable cause statement for Jeff's arrest, and the newly elected prosecutor approved the warrant on August 10th of 2002. 13 years after Jeff's family was brutally taken from this world, he was arrested on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Craig, accompanied by a SWAT team, went to surround Jeff's house, but he wasn't home. Jeff, now 30 years old, was in Los Angeles after returning from a work trip to Australia. While at the airport, Customs detained him because a warrant for his arrest had been issued. Jeff was now going to fight a battle in court, and his apparent motive was that he wasn't allowed to go to prom. Jeff's sister Jacques and his wife Kim found a defense attorney named Alan Baum. Alan had never heard of the case before, but he agreed to take on Jeff's defense. His first move was to try to get Jeff bond, but this wasn't successful because Jeff was considered a flight risk. From 2003 to 2006, there were multiple delays in the trial. Alan kept trying to get the case thrown out, arguing that Jeff's right to a speedy trial had been violated. Jeff was eventually released on bond for most of 2005. In 2006, it was finally time for the trial. The lead prosecutor, Frank Schaefer, argued that Jeff was responsible for the murders, even though there was almost no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. Alan, on the other hand, argued that the police investigation had been flawed and they had focused too much on Jeff without considering other possibilities. Both of Jeff's remaining siblings, Jacques and Jesse, took the stand, and they had different things to say. Jessie testified that she had seen the 20-gauge shotgun hanging in her parents' bedroom before she left for her sleepover, but Jacques said that the shotgun had been removed the year before, along with all other firearms in the house. Jeff had mentioned this during his police interrogation as well, explaining that their father, Bob, decided to get rid of the firearms in the house because he didn't think Jeff was safe around them. Bob had given the guns to a man named Thomas Kebb. Thomas had stored a bag containing the shotgun, a rifle, and a pistol at his in-laws' house in their basement. The strange part was that investigators never spoke to Thomas or asked for the guns. Alan, the defense attorney, chose not to use Thomas as a witness because he believed that Jeff's mental state during that time might have influenced the jury's decision. On the other hand, the prosecution didn't want to call Thomas because they feared it would weaken their case against Jeff. Additionally, Jessie testified that her mom told her Jeff was going to Six Flags Great America, which Alan believed could raise doubts about Jeff's involvement, as it seemed like he had permission to go to prom. So why would he kill his family? Additionally, remember Dave, the man who first discovered the crime scene? Initially, he said the blood at the scene was still wet, implying the deaths had happened not long before. But when Dave testified in 2006, he switched his story, saying the blood was actually dry. There were also wet washcloths found nearby, and Alan, Jeff's lawyer, brought in an expert to show that washcloths would have been dry after about 12 hours. However, because the experiments were conducted in Arizona, the court didn't accept the results. Even more suspicious, no blood traces were found on Jeff's jeans, and Alan argued that Jeff wouldn't have had enough time to carry out the crime in under 15 minutes. After all, Jeff was just 17 years old at the time. Most teens wouldn't have been able to clean up a crime scene that quickly, especially since, according to everyone who knew him, Jeff didn't act strangely after those minutes. Another piece of strange evidence came from Bob's stomach, where they found popcorn kernels. Jacques, Jeff's biological sister, testified that Bob had a habit of eating popcorn every night between 7 and 8 p.m., usually after he put the girls to bed. In fact, a bowl of popcorn was found on Bob's desk, suggesting he had time to make and eat it before the crime took place. There were also 2 different types of shotgun shells found at the scene, plastic and paper, leading Alan to suggest that either 2 shooters or 2 different shotguns were involved. On top of that, the Mossberg 500 shotgun found in the Pelley house could only hold 5 rounds, but 6 shots were fired, casting more doubt on Jeff being the sole perpetrator. Now, Jeff never took the stand in his defense, as his lawyers believed it would be too risky. On July 22, 2006, he was convicted on all charges, and on October 17th, he was sentenced to 160 years in prison. Some, like Jeff's stepsister Jessie, felt relieved by the conviction, but the story didn't end there. A new lawyer, Francis Watson, has been tirelessly working to prove that Jeff was wrongfully convicted. Watson has uncovered evidence that Jeff's original lawyer, Alan, didn't do his job properly during the trial. He believes the prosecution lied about the jeans, claiming they had been washed when they weren't, and that the lack of blood on Jeff supports his innocence. Watson also argues that Jeff's right to a speedy trial was violated, adding another layer to the case. A major new twist in the case involves Bob's connection to a man named Philip Hawley, who also had ties to Jeff when he left Lakeville. In fact, Philip may be the reason Bob and his family were tragically killed. Bob worked at Landmark Bank in Florida and had a close working relationship with Philip, who was Bob's supervisor. Philip was deeply involved in handling large financial transactions at the bank, and it turns out Bob discovered some serious financial fraud happening among his closest friends. This revelation left Bob terrified for his life. Pastor Michael Ross testified that Bob sought him out for advice about his fears, telling him he was worried for the safety of his family. Jeff Pelley, Bob's daughter, also remembered how her father's paranoia grew during this time. Things took a strange turn when a woman named Toni Beeler, who worked at United Church Directories, came forward. She reported that Bob had confided in her, expressing fears that people were after him. Sadly, this crucial testimony was never shared in the trial because, incredibly, the recordings of her interview with investigators were mysteriously lost. Adding to the intrigue, a man named Eric Dawson, who was connected to the same bank and financial dealings, was murdered in a manner very similar to Bob's. Eric had become friends with Philip Hawley, and after his disappearance, it was discovered that Philip had forged documents and engaged in various fraudulent activities, including misrepresenting financial transactions. Eric's body was found months after his disappearance, and authorities eventually uncovered a complex web of financial crimes tied to Philip and his family. Despite an extensive investigation, Philip was only convicted of forgery and theft, while his family members received little to no punishment. Even more suspicious was the fact that Philip Hawley was the beneficiary of a life insurance policy linked to a man named Harry Stewart, who was later exposed as a non-existent person. Bob Pelley had worked with Philip during this time, which raises serious questions about why Phil would have been the beneficiary of such a policy. This case is filled with many unanswered questions. Why were the guns never found? Why was Jeff not allowed to testify in his own defense? Could there have been multiple people involved in the crime? And why are there inconsistencies in the evidence, such as the claims about the washed jeans and missing shotguns? The new lawyer working on Jeff's case has uncovered significant flaws in the original investigation, suggesting that Jeff might have been wrongfully convicted. In 2024, despite all this new evidence and a push for a new trial, Jeff was denied for the fourth time. St. Joseph County Judge Stephanie Steele ruled that Jeff did not meet the burden of proof needed for a new trial.
The judge has denied Jeff Pelley's petition for a retrial. Pelley was convicted of killing his father, stepmother, and two stepsisters in Lakeville in 1989, so he could attend crime-related activities. A three-day hearing was held in March of 2022 to give Pelley's legal team a chance to present new evidence in the case.
When you think about it, if Jeff really were the killer, he would have to be one seriously skilled assassin. Imagine the level of expertise required for a 17-year-old boy to take out two adults and two children, clean up, and still have time to act like nothing happened, all within 15 minutes. And to top it off, he went to prom that evening, laughing and having fun with friends. The next morning, he was back at the park, seemingly unaffected. This case is incredibly wild and raises more questions than answers. It doesn't add up when you really break it down. But I want to hear what you think. Do you believe Jeff is innocent? Or do you think he's guilty? And what really happened on the night of the murders? The tragic tale of the Richardson family murders shattered the peaceful image of Medicine Hat, Alberta. At the center of this shocking crime was a 12-year-old girl, Jasmine Richardson, who became entangled in a forbidden relationship with 23-year-old Jeremy Steinke, a man with a troubled past and dark obsessions. This is the story of how a rebellion can go deadly wrong, of manipulation that can be spun out of control, lives tragically cut short. Most chillingly, it reminds us how easily the darkness in human nature comes to the fore and how superficially ordinary the lives can look while they host turmoil beyond our imagination. Together, they hatched a plan, one that will leave an entire family dead and a community reeling with sadness and horror. What would make a teenage girl and her far older boyfriend commit such a heinous crime? How can love, or what they perceived as love, become so derailed to cause destruction? In this tragic case, we will examine what led up to the murders, what came afterward, and the questions that still linger for those who remember the Richardson family. Medicine Hat, Alberta was a quiet town where neighbors waved to one another, kids rode bikes, and weekends were marked by block parties and backyard barbecues. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to go wrong until 2006, when a crime so horrifying it shook the entire nation and changed everything. The Richardson family looked to be the very portrait of a typical suburban family. In Medicine Hat, Alberta, the Richardson family made it known to their community as a very affectionate and close family. Mark Richardson worked for the oil industry. His occupation was a tough one, where he used his due diligence to perform his job and make a comfortable living for his family. He was as dedicated to his job as he was to his family. His wife, Deborah Richardson, was a stay-at-home mom. Her warm and amiable nature made her very popular with the neighbors and friends. She was actively involved in the lives of her two kids, volunteering at their school and making sure all their needs were well taken care of. The couple's two children brought different dynamics into the home. Jacob is the youngest at 8 years old, and what a real bubbly and carefree boy he was. He loves to play with friends, is fond of drawing, and spends hours glued to his favorite cartoons. His innocence combines with such fresh energy that it makes the home of the Richardson family laugh and lighten up with joy. Jacob is the type of little boy who can brighten up any room with smiles. The family had a 12-year-old daughter named Jasmine, who was at another stage of life, trying to negotiate the conflicts of adolescence. Like many preteens, she was trying to work out her identity and quest for independence. Jasmine was always bright and inquisitive. However, with her increasing attraction to goth subculture, changes in her were becoming more marked. She was gradually becoming more withdrawn and belligerent, testing boundaries with her parents. Her interests in dark clothing, alternative music, and edgy online communities began to concern Mark and Deborah. At first, they dismissed it as a phase, the normal emanation of some rebellion in a teenager. But Jasmine's increasingly pugnacious personality and mood swings since then had suggested to them that more than mere acting out was going on. Though they were concerned by the changes in Jasmine's behavior, the Richardsons were and would remain a close family. With Mark and Deborah working hard to provide a stable and nurturing environment for their children, they felt that patience and understanding would eventually guide Jasmine back onto a positive path. They set boundaries while trying to encourage open communication to bridge the gap that they, as a family, seemed to be forming from their daughter. To outsiders, the Richardson family looked like a perfect family, a model of suburban harmony. Their house was filled with laughter and warmth, along with the normal ups and downs of family life. But beneath the surface, tensions were quietly building. Jasmine's independence and acts of defiance caused her to clash with her parents and create a fracture that would ultimately have tragic consequences. The cheerful presence of Jacob only compounded the innocence of what was to come next. His playful spirit and close bond with his family made the Richardson tragedy even more devastating. And how this ostensibly ordinary family's story would go on to reveal, in a fashion nobody could think of, stun a community, and leave the nation in reeling shock at a truth that hardly seemed believable. This is the life of Jasmine Richardson, which took a dark turn when she met Jeremy Steinke, a 23-year-old man who, like her, was into the goth subculture. The two had met through mutual acquaintances and over online forums dedicated to their shared interests. It wasn't long before their connection really heated up, fueled by a common impulse for transgressive thrill-seeking and an attraction to the darker elements of life. What was most alluring to Jasmine was Jeremy's theatrical character. His thick black eyeliner and wardrobe full of black, along with his weird assertion of being a 300-year-old werewolf, made him so mysterious and therefore greatly magnetic for her. Jeremy came from a troubled background marked by abandonment and relentless bullying. These early experiences shaped his rebellious persona, one that glorified darkness and defied societal norms. To Jasmine, he was mysterious and exciting, a stark contrast to her structured suburban life. Jasmine's relationship with Jeremy became very intense very quickly, in spite of the fact that he was much older than her and also exhibited quite a few red flags. To Jasmine, Jeremy would soon become more than just a love interest. He became a confidant, a partner in rebellion. He listened to her talking about her parents, about being misunderstood, validated her frustration with them, feeding into the growing feeling of estrangement from them. His control over her grew with each passing day. When Mark and Deborah Richardson found out their daughter was involved with Jeremy, they were horrified. The age gap alone was disturbing enough, but more than that, it was Jeremy's creepy persona and the power he had over Jasmine that really worried them. Firm in their resolve to protect their daughter, they put strict rules in place, forbade her from seeing Jeremy, and watched everything she did closely. Mark and Deborah hoped these steps would sever the toxic connection and get Jasmine back on a healthier path. But these only made them more alienated from their daughter. Jasmine was going through teenage rebellion, and the image of her parents came out as people who were going to obstruct her path toward happiness. Rather than discouraging her, their restrictions bonded her even more to him, and the couple started to develop a dangerous mentality that defined Mark and Deborah as the people who were out to thwart their love and freedom. Jeremy's influence over Jasmine slowly turned dark. As they fed each other's resentment toward her family, their mutual fixation on Gothic themes and rebellion against society warped into a twisted justification for growing contempt because they dreamt of a life free from all controls placed upon them by Jasmine's home. They stepped into something a lot darker, a lot more sinister. What started out as a teenage rebellion took a much darker turn. No longer an uneasy alliance between Jasmine and Jeremy, this became the very fuel for the fire that is going to shock the entire community, leaving a scar on those who know and deal with the Richardsons. Forbidden by Jasmine's parents, the young lovers had to resort to secrecy to stay in touch. The connection they shared was torrid, a joint rebellion of sorts which intensified in the shadows. Email, text messaging, and instant online chats kept them alive with each other without her parents finding out. Mark and Deborah Richardson. These clandestine exchanges became a space where their frustrations and dark fantasies took root, eventually spiraling into a chilling plot. Jeremy, with his taste for the dramatic and the sinister in language, coming together with Jasmine's fascination with rebellion, was the kind of catalyst that would further escalate the situation. He validated her anger against her parents, suggesting to her that they were not standing up to him out of an illegitimate concern against their love. The digital trail they left behind is a horrifying descent into shared delusions, where their conversations began to revolve around the idea of eliminating those that were in their way. What began as teenage venting soon turned sinister as their conversations evolved into real plans for murder. One particular email exchange stands out as especially chilling. Jasmine allegedly wrote, "I have this plan. It starts with me killing them and ends with me living with you." The chill in her words, the ice in her tone, left no doubt as to her state of mind. Far from trying to dissuade her, Jeremy threw his arms open wide in embracing the idea of himself as a willing accomplice who would stop at nothing just to be able to stay with her. He boasted about his ability to get ready and commit murder, that his words blended fantasy with intent. This joint delusion had nurtured and grown in every communication while feeding on each other's darker thoughts. Their fantasies developed in their lives over time and gained weight with every passing instance. Soon enough, they became so substantial that their plans seemed very much like something real. Methods were discussed, followed by timing and what actions the girls would take when executing their dreary plans. Jeremy was true to form. Using fascination with Gothic themes and violence as part of his identity, he armed himself with a knife, a chilling prelude to the horrifying events to come. With this couple, it was no longer the passing thought of murdering Jasmine's family, worked out in every detail, an event the couple convinced themselves would finally free them from authority. The date was set, April 22, 2006. In their twisted minds, that day would mark the beginning of their life together. It was to be that evening when they would massacre the Richardson family, thus freeing Jasmine from what she felt was controlling her, and to live with Jeremy without interference. The finality and resolve in their planning brings into sharp relief the great depths to which they had sunk into their shared fantasy. As the day approached, the horrifying nature of their intentions became clearer and clearer. A relationship that had seemed to be grounded in the typical angst of a teenager wanting independence had transformed into something unimaginably dark. To the Richardson family, April 22nd would bring an end to an ordinary suburban life, but also an end to all that they had built together. Shocking tragedy, born from toxic and delusional love. The Richardson household was unusually quiet on the night of April 22, 2006. Inside, Mark and Deborah Richardson were settling in for a typical evening with no idea of the terror that would soon descend upon them. Their once happy family home, full of laughter and the ordinary sounds of life, would soon become a house of butchery. Outside, Jeremy Steinke approached the house armed and resolute, ready to put into effect a horrific plan hashed in secret. Outside, an all-too-willing 12-year-old Jasmine Richardson waited for him as the nightmare began to unfold. Jeremy entered the house with his intention quite obvious and his weapon at the ready. His first contact was with Deborah, the matriarch of the family. She, realizing the menace that was standing in front of her, fought back with everything she could muster. Her maternal instinct screamed for her to do everything possible to safeguard her family. The struggle was desperate, but Jeremy's attack was savage and relentless. Bravely as she fought, Deborah was no match and fell to his viciousness. The commotion roused Mark, who came rushing to the scene to help his wife. He found her under attack and tried to intervene, but Jeremy's onslaught was just as merciless. Mark, with all his strength and determination, was no match for the ferocity of the attack, and he too fell at the hands of Jeremy's relentless violence. The loss of both parents in such a horrific manner sent the Richardson home into chaos and despair. Amid the chaos, 8-year-old Jacob hid in his bed, clutching whatever he could find to comfort him, frightened and disoriented. The sounds of violence must have been unimaginable to the young boy, who probably hoped that by remaining silent, he would be spared. But Jeremy showed no mercy at all. He hunted down Jacob and killed the young boy in an act so pointless and brutal, it highlighted the depravity of the night. Witnesses and later investigators reported that Jasmine either actively assisted or, at the very least, helped to enable Jeremy in the murder of Jacob. The extent of her involvement added another layer of horror to an already unimaginable crime. By the time the bloodshed had stopped, the Richardson home was one of unimaginable carnage. The walls and floors were soaked in blood, and unnatural stillness, silence settled over the house. The warmth and love that had once filled this family environment were transformed into a house of horror in a matter of hours. The sheer violence of the crime left even experienced investigators shaken. And with the murders, Jasmine and Jeremy fled, and in that flight, left the shattered remains of a family. In their actions, 3 lives were taken from those who had every right to live them, along with any semblance of a sense of community safety and normalcy. From a symbol of suburban stability, the Richardson family became a cautionary tale for all that knew them, the epicenter of tragedy. It was to be a threshold night of darkness, marking no turning back, with so many questions still unasked and an overall feeling of loss seeping in. It was the next morning when peace in this quiet suburban neighborhood was shattered, as a boy came to the Richardson home to play with his best friend, Jacob. No one answered when he rang the front doorbell. Curiosity got the better of him, and he peered through a window, and what he saw would forever haunt him. Inside, the bloodied bodies of Mark and Deborah Richardson lay motionless. The scene was ghastly, an unbelievable sight for anyone, let alone a child. Terrified, he fled to wake his parents up. They immediately dialed the police. What police found when they arrived at the Richardson home was a scene of unthinkable carnage. Blood covered the walls and the floor. The gruesome pictures told of the terrible violence that had taken place that night. As the officers further entered the house, they found Mark and Deborah's dead bodies in the living room, and an 8-year-old boy, Jacob, was found dead on the floor in his bedroom. The brutality of the crime left even veteran officers shaken. Initially, the fact that 12-year-old Jasmine was missing led to fears of abduction. Police believed she might have been kidnapped by the killer, possibly another victim of that heinous crime. An Amber Alert was considered as investigators scrambled to piece together what had happened. But as they scoured the scene for evidence, their suspicions began to shift. But the discovery of Jasmine's belongings, complete with disturbing messages exchanged with an older man, Jeremy Steinke, painted a far more sinister and disturbing picture. And the more the investigators dug, the more they found. Emails, social media messages, and exchanges of text between Jasmine and Jeremy that alluded to their sinister plan. They had discussed their mutual fantasies of murder and a plan to kill anyone who would come between them. It became all the more obvious that Jasmine was no victim, but an active accomplice in the crime. Meanwhile, Jasmine and Jeremy had left the crime scene and driven a few miles to a town where they were to hide from police. They went into hiding at some friend's place who did not have any idea about the killings. People in that place stated later that the couple were carrying on as if nothing had happened. They were photographed laughing, holding hands, and kissing, their carefree demeanor a chilling testimony to their detachment from the atrocities they had committed. Most unnerving was their lack of remorse. This fact underlined even more the warped dynamic between these two. Their attempts at hiding did not last long. Within 24 hours, police, using witness reports and evidence from the crime scene, tracked them down. The couple was arrested, and their cold-blooded plot came to a jarring stop. That Jasmine was involved added another layer to an already inexplicable and shocking tragedy in the eyes of the community. The Richardson murders was a story that continued to enthrall and horrify, an incident whose chilling evidence told of how innocence could swiftly slip into darkness. The trial following the gruesome murders of Jasmine's family members made national headlines. Being one of the most disturbing criminal cases in recent decades, it touched off debate after debate over the nature of youth involvement in violent crimes and the responsibilities of adults in influencing minors. Jasmine, only 12 years of age at the time of the murders, was tried under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. This law entitles her, because of age, to particular protections. Nonetheless, she was put on trial just like any adult for her actions in a court of law. Because Jeremy was aged 23 years, he too was tried as an adult. The full weight of the law bore down upon him. Prosecutors at trial painted a chilling narrative of the perverse relationship that Jasmine and Jeremy shared, portraying a picture of a young girl who was more than just an active participant in the ruthless scheme and planning that went into the cruel murder. The prosecution described how Jeremy had coldly manipulated Jasmine, using his control over her to get her to go along with the murders of her own family members. They said that though young, Jasmine was well aware of the seriousness of her acts and bore equal responsibility for the murders. The killings had been harrowing in their details, and prosecutors insisted that this was a case of premeditated murder, not some spontaneous act of violence. In contrast, the defense team endeavored to emphasize the vulnerability of Jasmine at 12 years of age and argued that she was easily influenceable by an older, more experienced individual like Jeremy. They claimed that Jasmine had been brainwashed and forced to commit the murders. Therefore, she was not actually aware of what she was doing or fully realizing the gravity of the action she had committed. The defense depicted Jeremy as a manipulative individual who had exploited the naivety and emotional immaturity of Jasmine to use her trust for his own evil deeds. They urged the court to take her age and the very real likelihood that she had been led astray into account, being incapable of making decisions for herself. As the trial developed, so did the evidence against both defendants. Testimony from witnesses, forensic evidence, and a deep look into the relationship between the couple painted a picture of a pattern of manipulation and control by Jeremy. The defense of brainwashing wasn't enough to convince the jury that Jasmine's participation in the murders was more than just being under the influence of another. She had been an active participant in the planning, execution, and aftermath of the killings, leaving no doubt that she was criminally responsible. Finally, the court gave its verdict. Jasmine was pronounced guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. While her youthfulness had to be taken into consideration during the sentencing, her actions were by far too severe in nature for her to be let off with an easy sentence. So she was sentenced to the maximum penalty possible for a juvenile, 10 years in a youth detention facility, including 4 years spent in a psychiatric facility and 4 years under conditional supervision. Meanwhile, Jeremy got the toughest possible sentence, 3 consecutive life sentences without chance of parole for 25 years. The sentence was reflective of the heinous nature of the crimes, but in many ways, the fact that Jeremy was central to all of this, bringing the other 2 into it through his manipulative ways. When she was released in 2016, Jasmine was given complete anonymity to protect her privacy and to help her adjust to life outside the institution. She has, under a new identity, reportedly started afresh, away from the glare of the public eye that had followed her case for years. Her release marked the end of a legal odyssey that had drawn widespread national attention and stirred a wide debate. To many, her case is one of rehabilitation and redemption, a paean to the possibility of reform by young offenders in appropriate circumstances. Her supporters point out that she did serve her full sentence, time in a psychiatric facility, plus completing all requirements for conditional supervision without incident. To them, she is a case study in how the justice system can give second chances, more so for the young who might have been coaxed or otherwise induced into committing acts that are heinous. Others will, however, not agree with this. To the critics, giving Jasmine a new identity and a second chance at leading a normal life does not quite balance the enormity of her crimes. They wonder whether justice was ever really served for the family whose members' lives she violently snuffed out. Her anonymity felt like insulation from accountability, and critics thought it set bad precedents, undermining the seriousness of what she had done. It gives evidence to a deeper debate over the young and justice, that is, chances for rehabilitation, how to strike a balance in considering on one end the shielding of vulnerable offenders and, on the other end, justice for the victims. Often cited as an example, her case is almost always hotly debated in the debate over the morality and utility of sentencing minors for violent crimes. While this may be Jeremy's story, he himself remains in prison, serving the brunt of his sentence. 3 life sentences with no chance of parole for 25 years. Jeremy's case differs from Jasmine's in one major respect. His identity has never been concealed, and so he often figures as the aggressor in these tragic events. His part in the crime has often been examined to explain a kind of relationship that seems to deteriorate into an inexplicable downward spiral. The influences of Jeremy upon Jasmine, his background, his motives, had been a subject of psychological studies and media analysis. His story will always serve to remind one, to give an example of the worst that unbridled manipulation and dysfunctional dynamics can unleash when allowed to culminate in unbelievable acts of violence. To many, Jeremy epitomizes the dark side of relationships, in which control and manipulation supplant trust and respect. His ongoing incarceration, to some, serves as a form of protection from doing harm to others. But his case does bring up questions as to how much more could have been helped by mental health intervention and what the responsibilities of society are in trying to halt these kinds of behaviors before they grow into tragedy. In a nutshell, the case of Jasmine and Jerry continued to echo and served as a social research into the crime, justice, and problem of human behavior. Their case went on to show the complexity in criminal justice, especially for minors, how shocking it was to remind them of the far-reaching consequences of violence and toxic relationships. The Richardson family murders are the icy reminder of how a life that appears quite normal can plunge so quickly and unexpectedly into tragedy too terrible to be imagined. This case, extremely disturbing, places us face to face with questions that are not easy to deal with, pointing to the dark side of love, manipulation, and human relationships' thin veneer. It flags how dangerous, toxic dynamics can spiral into catastrophic consequences, even within a family that appeared on the surface to be loving and stable. The case of Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke shook the very foundation of the small community of Medicine Hat, Alberta, and was felt far and wide even today. What really set this case apart, however, was the especially heinous nature of the murders and the extreme youth of those involved. Jasmine was but a 12-year-old girl at the time. Few cases in the history of Canadian true crime have had such a significant impact. It exposed vulnerabilities of youth to manipulation while also touching on very difficult questions of culpability, rehabilitation, and justice. To the people of Medicine Hat, the murders are more than a sad chapter in their history. They're a ghostly reminder of how fragile trust can be and how devastating the consequences can be once that trust is broken. The case, even years later, still sparks an outrage reaching far beyond the town's borders, drawing in and unsettling all who hear about it. The Richardson family murders highlight the complexities of human behavior and the far-reaching impact of violence on individuals, families, and communities. The Richardson family murders are a case in point as to the very many intricacies of human behaviors and just how far, in what measure, violence may ripple through individual persons, families, and communities.
It was bad for Bill and Nancy to have to die the way they did. But for a 7-year-old girl to die that way, to be wrapped with plastic, to be wrapped with duct tape, to have a 60-pound rock strapped to her body and thrown into a lake, there was no excuse.
Killing an entire family is already a horrifying act, but to torture a child while her parents helplessly watched? That's pure evil beyond anything words can capture. This became the burning drive for the whole Pope County Sheriff's Office in Arkansas back in 1996. What started as an unthinkable, brutal crime would soon pull back the curtain on an even darker web of secrets, all tied to one terrifying thing: white supremacy. No doubt about it, this is one of the most disturbing and ruthless cases we've ever covered on this channel. And it leaves you with one huge question. How does a mindset this twisted spiral into such heartless violence? Now, before we try to answer that, let's take a closer look at the victims, the Mueller family. For starters, the Muellers weren't just any ordinary family. They were gun enthusiasts, a lifestyle that defined much of their world. The father, William Mueller, wasn't just a passionate collector. He was a federal firearms licensee, meaning he was a licensed gun dealer. He also worked as a self-employed electrician, and his life revolved around guns, selling them, buying them, and even using them. He was married to Nancy, and together they raised their 8-year-old daughter, Sarah, their only child. They loved her with all their hearts, and she was the center of their world. The family lived in Tilly, Arkansas, a small, tight-knit community where William and Nancy homeschooled Sarah. Weekends were often spent at gun shows, a shared hobby that only brought them closer together as a family. Given this, it's no surprise that their home was packed to the brim with firearms, ammunition, and a hefty stash of cash. With all that valuable loot just sitting there, it made the perfect target for a robbery. And that's exactly what happened in 1995. The Mueller home was broken into by a man named Kirby Kehoe, who, shockingly, was a family friend. He stole guns and cash, but instead of letting this setback shake them, the Mueller family didn't miss a beat. The robbery didn't stop their passion for firearms or their business. Now, keep this robbery in mind because it's going to be crucial in the investigation that unfolds later. Fast forward to January of 1996. The Mueller family was out of the house, probably spending some quality, relaxed time together. But little did they know, waiting in the shadows of their home were two monsters, ready to strike the moment they walked through the door. As soon as they entered, the Muellers were confronted by these two men. They were dressed like FBI agents, but don't be fooled. These guys weren't the real deal. They were imposters. Without wasting a second, they tied the family to chairs, and when William Mueller, who was 52 years old at that time, refused to cooperate, things took a terrifying turn. The intruders separated the family, and they began to torture them while interrogating. They did everything in their power to force the Muellers to talk. But when the parents still didn't give in, they turned their attention to the 8-year-old Sarah. This is where it gets absolutely chilling. Sarah was interrogated about the family's fortune, about where they kept their money and valuables. And to make her talk, one of the men shocked her with an electric cattle prod. While this isn't enough to kill a person, the pain is excruciating, especially for a young child like Sarah. After the little girl gave them the information they were after, they found $50,000 in cash, along with guns and ammunition. Now, you might think they'd just grab what they came for and leave, but that's not how it went. The nightmare was far from over. The Muellers were then subdued with stun guns, which knocked them unconscious. The intruders took their sweet time with this, almost like they were enjoying the slow, agonizing process. But it didn't stop there. The worst was yet to come. The two men suffocated them by placing sealed plastic bags over their heads. Imagine the horror of knowing your entire family is being tortured, helpless, and unable to stop it. That's the reality the Muellers were facing in those final moments. Now, if you thought the Muellers were found dead right after that horrifying night, well, you'd be wrong. The truth is, 2 weeks passed before anyone realized something was horribly wrong. Nancy Mueller's mom, Earlene Branch, hadn't heard a word from her daughter in all that time. That was totally unlike Nancy. She always called after their trips, especially when they went to those gun shows. So Earlene couldn't shake that gut feeling something bad had happened. She reached out to the sheriff, sharing her growing concern. Sheriff Jay Winters knew the Muellers, even though they lived in a neighboring county, and he agreed to help. But when he spoke to people in the neighborhood, they didn't seem worried at all. Most people figured the Muellers had just taken off somewhere, maybe a quick trip or a break from everything, and hadn't bothered to check in. It almost felt like everyone thought they were just giving themselves some space, and everything was fine. Then, on February 11th, an entire month later, the case took a terrifying turn. A farmer just going about his day found the Muellers' Jeep. It was hidden, abandoned on the side of the highway, far from where it should have been. This discovery set the investigation into motion again. Inside the Jeep was Nancy Mueller's purse, and it still held her wallet and ID. But the trailer was empty, with no sign of the family anywhere. As days turned into weeks, weeks into months, the Muellers' disappearance became even more unsettling. No leads, no clues, just the eerie silence of their absence. Then, 5 months later, a twist in the case came when an elderly couple decided to spend a day fishing in a bayou near Russellville. While waiting for a bite, the woman snagged her fishing line on something, and when she tried to free it, she quickly realized she had hooked a boot that still held the bone of a man's leg inside it. Horrified, she cut the line and rushed for help. This set off another search, led by Sheriff Winters, who organized teams to scour the bayou with metal hooks and divers. By the end of the day, they had recovered parts of a body. The torso was weighed down by a rock and the head was wrapped in duct tape. From the moment investigators saw the body, they knew this wasn't some ordinary crime. It looked like an execution, deliberate, cold, and calculated. The body was that of a small female, and at first investigators thought it could be the body of a 6-year-old girl who had been reported missing from a nearby county the year before. But when they examined the size and the clothing, it didn't match. That's when they started to wonder, could this be Sarah Mueller? The next day, 2 more partial bodies were discovered. All 3 torsos were weighed down with rocks, and their heads were wrapped in plastic bags, secured tightly with duct tape. It was a chilling scene. Using dental records, DNA, and clothing, the authorities confirmed the identities of the bodies. It was William Mueller, his wife Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah. What had started as a missing persons case had quickly turned into a brutal triple homicide investigation. When the coroner examined the bodies, they concluded that they'd probably been in the water since January 11th, the last day anyone had seen them. But there was more to the story. The investigators found tiny specks of blue paint stuck to the tape. They sent the paint samples to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for testing, and it was confirmed that the paint matched the type used on General Motors vehicles. With this new lead, investigators pieced together that 2 people must have been involved. One drove the blue car with the bodies, while the other followed in the Mueller's Jeep. By the time the bodies were dumped in the water, the Muellers were likely already dead, suffocated by the plastic bags. The investigation soon turned back to the Muellers' belongings. Since the family had vanished, most of their valuables had been taken by relatives, but some items had been left behind, stored in their landlord's garage. Among the things found were a Colt .45 gun case with a serial number, but the gun was missing. They also found a family photo with some friends. The team entered the gun's serial number into the National Crime Information Center database, and bingo. The gun had been traced to a man named Travis Brake, who had been arrested months earlier in Seattle, Washington, for carrying a concealed weapon. He admitted that he'd bought the handgun at a gun show and described 2 men he had bought it from. One of the men stood out to him. Investigators showed Brake the photo they found among the Muellers' belongings, and Brake pointed to one of the men, Kirby Kehoe. If you remember, this was the same man who had robbed the Muellers a year prior, and this guy was no stranger to trouble. He had a long criminal history involving firearms and was heavily involved in the white supremacist movement. However, the investigators still needed solid evidence before they could make an arrest. Nearly a year after the Muellers' murder, investigators got a break in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. A trooper spotted a blue Chevy Suburban with suspicious bumper stickers parked in a handicapped spot. Inside, Sean Haynes and his pregnant girlfriend were found asleep. The trooper ran the serial numbers on 2 guns Haynes had in the vehicle and discovered one, a stolen AR-15 rifle, had belonged to the Muellers. Arrested and questioned, Haynes admitted he had traded another firearm for the rifle at a Washington motel 6 months earlier. The trader? Chevy Kehoe, Kirby Kehoe's eldest son. At this point, the investigators had 2 suspects, but before we dive deeper into the case, let's take a moment to understand the background of the Kehoe family. Trust me, knowing their story will shed light on why they did what they did. Now, the Kehoe family was nothing like the Muellers. Chevy Kehoe, 26 years old, grew up in a household where white supremacy wasn't just talked about, it was their way of life. Chevy wasn't your average troubled young man. His father's influence shaped everything, steering the family down a dark and hateful path. When Chevy was just a baby, the Kehoes packed their bags and left sunny Florida for the quiet hills of Madison County, North Carolina. Fast forward to the mid-'80s. The Kehoes moved again, this time to Stevens County in Washington. Initially, Chevy seemed like a bright kid with potential. He was an honor student at Colville Junior High School, but by 1988, his parents decided to homeschool him. Their reasoning? They wanted to provide more focused attention. But instead of fostering a healthy learning environment, they created a bubble of radical ideas. From a young age, he was pushed into a life of crime, learning robbery, theft, and how to fight off the cops. As you can imagine, the Kehoe home was a breeding ground for hate and paranoia. Anti-government beliefs were their bread and butter, and Chevy soaked it all up. He wasn't just a kid with big dreams. His dreams were violent, dangerous, and fueled by white supremacy. By the time he was a young man, Chevy had one goal: to overthrow the U.S. government and create his own white supremacist utopia, something he called the Aryan People's Republic. This wasn't just a phase. For Chevy, this twisted vision was everything, and his family were the foundation for his dangerous ideology. You could see this influence clearly in 1995, when Chevy took part in a violent kidnapping and robbery. In June of that year, he and a partner targeted Malcolm and Jill Friedman, a Jewish couple who owned a store where Chevy had once worked. The Friedmans were held at gunpoint, but this wasn't just a random crime. Chevy specifically went after them because of their ethnicity. This act was a clear reflection of the hate and violence he'd been raised to embrace. With everything going on, it was no surprise that both Kirby Kehoe and his son, Chevy Kehoe, had been on police radars for years. If Chevy was involved in all kinds of crimes, just imagine the trouble his father, Kirby, had been up to. But here's the kicker. Despite the long history of criminal activity, both of them were nowhere to be found. No one could track them down, and they seemed to vanish into thin air. That is, until February 15, 1977, when a state trooper in Ohio pulled over a blue Chevy Suburban. The car had been swerving, driving way too slowly, and just looked suspicious. While passing by, the driver didn't even glance at the trooper, but the passenger gave him a nod. The officer thought nothing of it until he realized the passenger kept staring at him through the rearview mirror, even after they passed him by. That was when the officer's instincts started kicking in. They ran the license plate and found that it had expired. To top it off, neither of them had valid driver's licenses. When the trooper asked the driver to get out of the vehicle, the guy complied, but warned the officer not to touch him. Then things took a turn. One of the deputies called for a tow truck to impound the vehicle, and that's when the driver suddenly bolted back to the car. The officers chased after him, but as they tried to subdue him, the guy who was sitting in the passenger seat pulled out a handgun and started firing at the officers, creating enough chaos for Chevy to jump back into the Suburban and make a break for it.
Asked the driver to step out of the car. The man told the officer he borrowed the truck from a friend. He then refused to a pat-down search. Listen as the officer attempts to search the man for weapons.
Any guns, knives, clubs, stuff like that on here, sir?
I don't want you going and searching through all my stuff.
I'm not searching through your stuff, sir. I'm going to put you in my car.
Oh, that's just fine, but
Now, do you have any guns, knives, clubs, or stuff like that on you? Very good.
Listen, sir, I don't want no problems.
I'm not going to give you any problems, sir.
Apparently, he did want problems. A few more minutes went by. Then the man ran back to his car in an attempt to get away. The passenger then opened fire on the police.
Please!
As the passenger ran into the woods, the driver sped away.
Turns out, the two men in that intense standoff were Chevy Kehoe and his brother, Cheney Kehoe. When Chevy took off in the Suburban, Cheney, who was in the passenger seat, bolted into the nearby woods. The cops spent the entire day searching for him, but as you might expect, they couldn't catch him. Now, just like Chevy, Cheney was also deeply embedded in white supremacy, and he wasn't afraid to use violence to push his beliefs. Later that day, Chevy found himself involved in another shootout, this time in the parking lot of an electrical supply company. He exchanged gunfire with two Wilmington police officers, Officer Richard Rick Wood and Sergeant Robert Bob Martin. During the chaos, an innocent bystander, 56-year-old Frank Marsden, was hit in the shoulder. The shootout was captured on the dash cameras of both the trooper and the sergeant, and it quickly became a major story. The footage was aired in 1997 on Fox's World's Scariest Police Shootouts and became a hit, showing up on other programs like Most Shocking and World's Most Amazing Videos. Meanwhile, the Kehoe brothers were on the run, traveling in secret with their families across multiple states in an RV. Investigators feared they'd stop at nothing to escape, and the police had to step up their efforts. They spread out images of the brothers, hoping someone would recognize them or the vehicle. At Lake Hill Campground, investigators discovered that the Kehoes had camped there in an RV, but they were 2 days too late. The RV had already left. Days turned into weeks, and sightings of the RV kept pouring in from across the country. They had been spotted in places like West Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Texas, and Montana, always just one step ahead of the law. In Indianapolis, the stolen van with Chevy's signature gas receipt was found, but there was no sign of Cheney. A few days later, the Kehoe's RV was found abandoned on a desolate stretch of road in Wyoming. When the police checked it out, they discovered a disturbing stash: guns, ammunition, fake FBI jackets, U.S. Marshals badges, and a box full of bomb-making materials. The ATF bomb squad was called in to inspect, and although they didn't find any live devices, the components made it clear the Kehoes were preparing for something far worse. Authorities were deeply concerned about the brothers' growing violence and what they might do next. As the search continued, it seemed like the Kehoes were always one step ahead. But then, on June 16, 1997, investigators received a tip. Cheney Kehoe, Chevy's brother, was ready to turn himself in. Cheney revealed where he and his brother had been hiding for the past few months, and authorities learned that after the shootouts in Ohio, they had taken refuge on a remote ranch in southern Utah. The owners had given them room and board in exchange for help on the farm. But things had gone south quickly when Chevy's temper flared and his paranoia grew. Chevy even spoke about killing his wife, Karina, who had Native American ancestry, and plotting to murder his own parents, Kirby and Gloria, to raise his younger brothers in his white supremacist vision. Then, on June 12th, Chevy's paranoia turned against his own brother. After a violent argument, Cheney feared for his life and the safety of his family. He decided to flee with his loved ones in the middle of the night, driving nearly 1,000 miles back to Washington State, and that ended their long time running. Chevy Kehoe was arrested on June 17, 1997. But that's not the most important part. The most interesting and important thing Cheney told law enforcement is that Chevy confessed to being involved in the murder of the Muellers with another unnamed male. Additionally, around that time, in June of 1997, Kirby Kehoe, the father of the Kehoe brothers, was also arrested. Now, as you can imagine, the arrest of the father didn't exactly fit the narrative everyone was expecting. He wasn't involved with the Mueller family's murder, nor was Cheney Kehoe. But just when the situation seemed to be unraveling, Gloria Kehoe, Chevy's mother, stepped forward to law enforcement and dropped a bombshell. Gloria revealed that her son, Chevy, had confessed to her about the horrifying details of the Mueller family slaying. She went on to explain that the murders weren't just some spontaneous act, they were planned out for a whole year. The plan went way back to the first robbery of the Mueller family back in February of 1995, which had apparently set everything in motion. According to Gloria, the chain of events started when William Mueller, the patriarch of the Mueller family, confronted Kirby Kehoe after suspecting him of being involved in the robbery. Apparently, during this confrontation, William Mueller was incredibly disrespectful to Kirby, which did not sit well with Chevy. In fact, it seemed to be the moment that flipped a switch in Chevy's mind. He thought that William's disrespect was enough to give him the green light to go ahead and rob and kill the Muellers. But there was more to it than just a grudge over disrespect. According to law enforcement, Chevy's motivation wasn't just personal. He had found out that William Mueller was in possession of some serious weaponry, expensive firearms, high-end gear, and ammunition, and that piqued Chevy's interest even more. Gloria didn't stop there. She named a second man involved in the murders, Daniel Lewis Lee. Lee wasn't a stranger to Chevy. He was someone Chevy knew through their involvement in white supremacy groups. both Chevy and Lee were heavily invested in the idea of creating a whites-only nation, and they were bound by their shared ideology. Together, they had planned to rob the Muellers, kill them, and cover up their tracks to avoid implicating themselves or Kirby in the crime. Gloria went on to explain that on January 11, 1996, the Mueller family had left for a gun show. While they were gone, Chevy and Lee dressed up as law enforcement officers and made their way to the Mueller home. When the Muellers returned, Chevy and Lee ambushed them, tying them up. But there was one part of the plan that didn't go as expected. According to Gloria, Lee was hesitant, especially when it came to killing Sarah Mueller, the Mueller family's daughter. Apparently, Lee just couldn't bring himself to do it, so Chevy took matters into his own hands and killed Sarah himself. Fast forward to March of 1999, and Daniel Lewis Lee and Chevy Kehoe stood trial for the triple murder. Both Cheney and Gloria Kehoe testified against them, spilling the details of what had happened. The trial ended with a conviction. Chevy Kehoe was sentenced to life in prison, while Daniel Lewis Lee was sentenced to death. Apparently, Daniel Lewis Lee also had a deeply troubled upbringing, one that was marked by instability and violence. From a young age, Lee faced significant challenges. He struggled with seizures and other neurological issues that often led him to be placed in mental health facilities. However, his time in these facilities was short-lived, as he was removed due to his violent behavior. His struggles were compounded by his inability to control his anger and his growing propensity for violence, which only seemed to escalate as he got older. By the time Lee was 17, his violent tendencies had already manifested in a chilling way. He was involved in the brutal murder of Joseph Wavra, which occurred during a robbery. It was the third murder in a string of violent crimes, but incredibly, Lee managed to avoid a murder charge. Instead, he received only a suspended sentence for the robbery, a decision that seemed more lenient than it should have been, given the severity of the crime. Unfortunately, this leniency did little to curb Lee's violent impulses. It only appeared to embolden him, allowing his thirst for violence to grow unchecked. It wasn't long before Lee crossed paths with Chevy Kehoe. The two met in 1995, and their shared hatred for the government and their twisted desire to establish a white supremacist stronghold brought them together. Now, Lee tried to soften his image in court, claiming he had a good side and that he could change. It felt a bit ridiculous, though. His past was full of violent acts. His plea for mercy sounded more like a movie redemption arc than reality. The court didn't buy it. Lee's past was too ugly, and no one believed he could really change. In the end, he was executed by lethal injection in 2020.
For the first time in 17 years, a federal prison inmate was executed this morning. Daniel Lewis Lee received a lethal injection in Indiana after the U.S. Supreme Court allowed the execution to proceed. He was convicted of murdering 3 members of an Arkansas family back in 1996, including an 8-year-old girl. Lee told witnesses this morning, though, that he didn't do it. The High Court, with conservative justices in the majority, voted 5-4 overnight to reverse the lower court rulings. Those courts had been concerned with what they called an unconstitutional risk of pain when it comes to lethal injection.
Despite being the mastermind behind the brutal murders of the Mueller family, Chevy Kehoe managed to escape the death penalty, while Daniel Lewis Lee, who had a less direct role, was sentenced to death. This didn't seem to make sense. How could the guy who planned and carried out the whole thing get a lighter sentence than his partner in crime? But what made things even crazier was that Chevy was involved in another huge crime, the Oklahoma City bombing. After Chevy was arrested, his brother Cheney claimed Chevy knew about the bombing before it happened. Apparently, Chevy was seen with Timothy McVeigh, the bomber, at a motel in Spokane months before the bombing. The manager of that motel even said that Chevy had been excited about the bombing when the news hit and had even hinted that something big was going to happen on April 19th. Yet, when the FBI looked into it, they couldn't find any proof that McVeigh had ever been in Spokane or that Chevy had any direct involvement in the bombing. Chevy denied everything, but the rumors just added to the mystery. It was clear that Chevy had ties to violent extremist groups, and yet he still got off easy compared to Lee. At the end, Cheney Kehoe received a 24-year sentence for attempted murder and weapons possession due to his role in an Ohio shootout, while their father, Kirby Kehoe, was sentenced to 44 months after pleading guilty to federal racketeering charges. Later, Cheney's sentence was reduced to 11 years, and he was released from prison in 2008. But Cheney's trouble with the law didn't end there. On October 14, 2013, he and Kirby were arrested by federal officials in Arizona after an ATF raid uncovered a large marijuana-growing operation and an arsenal of weapons at an off-grid compound. Authorities seized 17 firearms, nearly 17,000 rounds of ammunition, 15 pounds of marijuana, and various pieces of body armor. Both Cheney and Kirby pleaded guilty to being felons in possession of firearms and ammunition in 2014. Cheney was sentenced to 41 months in prison, while Kirby received a 10-year sentence. Cheney was released in September 2016, and Kirby followed in January 2022. As for Chevy, he spent much of his time at the United States Penitentiary, Florence ADX in Colorado, under the Federal Bureau of Prisons Register number 21300-009. He was later transferred to several different prisons, including United States Penitentiary, Florence High, and United States Penitentiary, McCreary in Kentucky. By 2022, Chevy Kehoe was being held at the United States Penitentiary, Terre Haute, and one can only hope that he's suffering there more than his victims did. But what do you think about all this? Do you believe justice was served, or do you think the law went too easy on them, especially considering their anti-government beliefs? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. In 2004, in the sunny city of Miami, a family's seemingly perfect life was shattered when a son's troubled past came back to haunt his parents in the most devastating way. This is the story of the Sutton family murder. Life was picture perfect for John and Susan Sutton. The couple adopted their first child, Christopher Sutton, in the late 1970s and welcomed their second child, Melissa, 7 years later. The tight-knit family of 4 lived in a luxurious home in Coral Gables, Florida. This upscale neighborhood near Miami is full of life and dreams. John was an attorney of high reputation. He was known for his mastery of the law and success in most high-profile cases he managed. He was licensed to practice law in the state since 1972. John's personality was unmatched. As for Susan Sutton, she was his loving wife and manager.
Susan was a head nurse of surgical intensive care. We did a lot of traveling together through the Caribbean. I had a couple of different boats and would take them to the Bahamas and scuba dive and fish.
She was his backbone in the office and the home. The Sutton family shared a love for education and community living. Both parents implemented discipline in their kids from an early age. Like every seemingly perfect family, there were challenges. Melissa was calm and obedient. She loved her home and did everything to protect it. She was everything a parent wanted. However, her brother was different. Christopher was a black sheep of the Sutton family, a role he seemed to have repented of. His parents believed he had left his troubled past behind. Unknown to them, he plotted evil. Beyond his newfound character were darker intentions. These intentions would later shatter the Sutton family. On August 22, 2004, John and Susan hosted a party in their home on Orduna Drive, off Granada Boulevard. This area was once known as the Devil's Den. Susan had just turned 57, and John's firm, Sutton Law Group, won 3 lucrative cases. The couple's son, Christopher, his fiancée, Juliet Driscoll, and John's law partner, Teddy Montoto, dropped by for the gathering. After the party, Christopher and Juliet left for the cinema while Teddy headed home. Tired from the evening's event, John and Susan retired to their separate bedrooms. Although married, the couple didn't share the same bedroom. John was notorious for his loud snores, and Susan couldn't handle them. She endured it for years before drawing the line. After saying their goodbyes, they went to bed. But then, this night would change their lives forever. In a dramatic twist, a gunman sneaked into their house at about 10:30 p.m. This stranger parked his car down the tree-lined streets of Coral Gables as he walked into the house. He was dressed in black to suit the event. The dog barely barked as he walked in through the back sliding door. He knew the door was never locked, so it was easy. This intruder had a 9mm Glock pistol. He was on a mission to kill John and Susan Sutton. Upon getting to Susan's room, shots rang out. He fired 6 shots at Susan, who was on the phone in the master bedroom. Before John realized it, the assailant barged into his room, shooting him in the torso and face. Despite his head injuries, John managed to call 911. He groaned in pain as he requested for an ambulance.
Coral Gables 911.
I need police. My house. I've just been assaulted.
What happened, sir?
Somebody came in and shot me.
They shot you?
Yes.
Who did it?
I don't know. I can't see. I need police and I need an ambulance.
Okay. Where did he shoot you?
My head.
Are you bleeding? Do you see any blood?
I'm bleeding all over, yes.
Okay.
Meanwhile, the Sutton attacker vanished into the night. Moments later, police swarmed the neighborhood from every direction. Medics drove the almost dying lawyer to a local trauma care center while confirming Susan's death. By this time, John was in a pool of his own blood. He lost so much blood that medics thought he would die. As police tried to wrap their heads around the incident, they noticed something was off. First, Susan's jewelry and John's wallet with cash were untouched. The person who did it was on a mission. He didn't want to mess with it. Again, one of the guests that night miraculously arrived at the scene. Teddy arrived right in time of the crime. He told the police that he was on the phone with Susan when he heard shots, so he raced to her house. Why was he on the phone with her at that time? Did Teddy want the couple dead? These questions prompted the police to name him the first suspect. Interrogations began the day after the shooting. Besides working at John's law firm, Teddy was a marksman. He was a competitive shooter and had been shooting earlier that day. This revelation raised eyebrows. In a bid to piece things together, Detective Cordero sent Teddy's gun for testing. While this was ongoing, she had a list of questions for the suspect. She felt he was hiding something about a secret relationship with Susan. Why else was he on the phone with her that night? After failing a polygraph test, Teddy confessed to having an affair with Susan. However, he had no motive to hurt her or her husband. Teddy's gun didn't match the murder weapon, and police cleared him of the crime. Detectives confirmed he wasn't in the Suttons' home during the shooting. Who would want the Suttons dead? As a successful lawyer, John had a fair share of enemies. He occasionally received death threats, most of which he dismissed. Police checked the records, scrutinizing every name, but they all had alibis. However, there was one more person they needed to check. A woman had stormed John's firm days before the attack. She was angry over a settlement issue and threatened to wreak havoc.
A lawyer who presumably had enemies.
Early on, there was a lady, and she had threatened to shoot up my office.
Now, that would be a classic example of a motive to commit murder.
The woman had a boat that may have helped her escape through the waterway that night. But when police dug deeper, they found no link between the woman and the shooting. Surveillance cameras showed the boat never left the marina where it was docked. If not her, then who? The police were back to square one. As they examined little details, they stumbled on Christopher's records. On the surface, he was a grieving son devastated by the tragedy. But as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered details of his past life. Layer by layer, his past began to unfold. Christopher got into lots of trouble as a teenager. He struggled with conduct-defiant disorder, a condition that led to frequent defiance and a lack of impulse control, making him difficult to parent. He was in and out of multiple schools. His parents wanted the best for him, but this teenager never understood. Upon dropping him off at a new school, he would sneak out through the back door into the street. He skipped classes and was not interested in learning. While in high school, he and some other kids broke into a teacher's house and spray painted it. He was later arrested and sued. Christopher was mean. He wanted to draw tattoos, do body piercings, and abuse drugs, even though his parents hated that. He got extremely angry and destroyed things if he didn't get his way. At 16, he already had a rifle. Years ago, he pointed it at Susan and Melissa. He threatened to shoot, but changed his mind. They would later discover that the rifle was unloaded. Even so, he was a bitter pill to swallow. Christopher developed so much hate for his parents that he planned to kill them for the inheritance. One day, Susan was cleaning his room and found a note. On that note, he expressed his desire to kill his parents. When she confronted him about it, he told a joke. Susan didn't take it lightly. She was scared for herself, her husband, and her daughter. She knew she had to act fast. They thought of getting a restraining order against him, but this was not enough. They wanted him out of the house by all means. What better way to get rid of a headstrong teenager than to send him to Paradise Cove, a disciplined boarding school in Samoa? Christopher was shipped to this strange city for a behavior modification program for troubled boys. His parents believed this was the answer to his problems. Christopher was only 17 when he arrived. Punishments were severe, and every rule counted in Paradise Cove. As someone used to breaking rules, Christopher spent hours in the isolation box. Offenders were sometimes bound with rope and dragged to the mountains, where they were hogtied and left in the open sky. Paradise Cove was a brutal cage that stripped people of their humanity. After 1 year in Paradise Cove, Christopher sent a video message to his parents.
I feel like I've been begging to get me out of your hair. I've been here for a year now, and I feel like I'm in the same spot as some of you guys. But I don't know how I feel like you guys tell me out here when I get level 3. I'm still pushing for level 3, but I don't even know if I want you guys to come out.
The tearful kid expressed disappointment in his parents. He believed they sent him there to get him out of their presence. He explained how toxic the environment was and pleaded to be taken home. He didn't want to be there. John and Susan traveled to Samoa to see things for themselves. Again, Christopher tried to convince them, but they didn't believe him.
Stories of it being torture were, I think, greatly exaggerated. He wanted to come back, I believe, to Miami and play.
It was then that the teenager became determined to leave. He swore to leave the premises on his 18th birthday, but his father got a court order to keep him there for another year. Christopher was angry. He hated his parents for doing that to him. His relationship with his parents became bumpy after he left Paradise Cove. After piecing these details together, investigators thought that Christopher knew something about the fatal shooting. Was this a revenge act against his parents for his time at Paradise Cove? The case was gradually coming to a close. Christopher's interrogation was straightforward. On the night of the shooting, he and Juliet left for the movie theater. He showed detectives the tickets, and surveillance cameras captured him leaving before midnight. But as they watched, something caught Detective Cordero's eye. Christopher was fixated on his cell phone on his way out. Phone records showed that he called the same number 331 times weeks before the shooting. He was constantly on the phone with Garrett Kopp, his childhood friend and smoking partner.
Months after the horrific events of August 22, 2004, police have arrested Garrett Kopp for the murder of Susan Sutton and the attempted murder of John Sutton.
Garrett was arrested less than 24 hours after the shooting for an unrelated event. He assaulted someone with a gun in another part of Miami and was apprehended. Detectives reached out to Garrett's arresting officer requesting the gun used for the assault. The officer obliged, and they took it for testing. Shockingly, it matched the rifle used in the Sutton shooting. Garrett Kopp was immediately invited for questioning. The tense interrogation lasted for 6 hours. Garrett didn't reveal much at first, but with pressure from officers, he spilled the beans.
Did he formulate this plan, or was it a combined effort between two of you?
He did.
What plan did he tell you? What did he want you to do?
Go in the back door, walk in, and shoot him.
He planned to go into the house and shoot the couple. In exchange, he'll get $100,000 from the $500,000 in insurance money. And if he dared tell anyone about it, Christopher threatened to kill Garrett and his son. Garrett narrated how Christopher was desperate to execute his parents. He even got him the gun used in the operation and directed his actions that night. Christopher deliberately left the sliding door on the back patio unlocked and described his parents' room to the assailant. Getting into the family house was easy since Christopher had it all planned. Susan was under her blanket when he fired 6 times. The police arrested Garrett, but their focus remained on Christopher. Determined to find a connection, they turned to someone who knew him well. It was none other than his girlfriend, Juliet. Officers invited her for questioning. Her confidence showed that she had nothing to hide. Juliet said she knew nothing about the crime. Although in a relationship with him, she didn't know about his plan. Over the 13-hour questioning, she maintained her innocence. She loved John and Susan like her parents and wouldn't hurt them. John gave her a job at his law firm and supported her financially, while Susan taught her hands-on skills like makeup and home management. Juliet became teary to convince them, but the officers were unmoved. They threatened her with arrest if she didn't speak the truth. At this point, Juliet knew she had to save herself. She revealed the deep-seated hatred her boyfriend nursed for his parents since they sent him to Samoa. He believed he would have been better if he hadn't gone there. He wanted them to pay for what they did to him. He was willing to retaliate, even if it took a decade. Officers already knew about his life in Samoa, but only wanted confirmation. Meanwhile, John woke up in intensive care with a massive injury that caused him to lose his sight. Melissa said her father was unrecognizable when she first saw him. It was a miracle that he survived. After his discharge from the hospital, John moved in with Christopher. Within those few days, his son tried to take over his bank account. He was shocked when he heard his son masterminded the shooting. Detectives called him early that morning, urging him not to let anybody in the house until they came. It made sense that Christopher wanted to get back at his parents. When officers arrived, they broke the news to him. Despite his health condition, he helped the police with information to solve his wife's murder. When news about Christopher's warrant got out, he was on the run for almost 2 weeks. He was eventually arrested, tried, and sentenced.
As the trial progresses, a clearer picture of who Chris Sutton is begins to emerge. The prosecution team will parade a string of witnesses on the stand to clearly illustrate the defendant's deep-seated anger and resentment. Anger and resentment that led to an obsession with revenge.
The much-awaited trial started on July 7, 2010. As proceedings began, John Sutton sat far from his son. Prosecutor Kathleen Hogue told the jury how Christopher hired a hitman to slay his parents. The plan was to shoot his parents and get paid when the defendant got his insurance money. They went into detail on the true situation of his life. Christopher did nothing but sell drugs when he returned from Samoa. He had no source of livelihood, but depended on his parents to survive. Garrett took the stand to share his side of the story.
Mr. Kopp, did you shoot to kill Susan Sutton?
Yes.
And did you succeed in killing Susan Sutton?
Yes.
With what type of a weapon?
Handgun.
Did you shoot to kill John Sutton?
Yes.
Did you succeed in killing John Sutton?
No.
He recounted all that happened that night, how he walked into the house, shot both parents, and walked out unnoticed. He and Christopher had planned the crime for months. His friend gave him $50 to buy black clothes for the crime at Walmart. Once again, he admitted that Christopher hired him to do the job. Well, Christopher's defense insisted that Garrett was lying. Defense lawyer Bruce Fleischer claimed that the police forced Garrett to testify in exchange for a 30-year plea deal. He said that the hitman was threatened with an electric chair to make a false confession. Christopher told the jury that his friend wanted to escape the death penalty by all means, even if it meant a false confession. Prosecutors still stood their ground on the true situation of things. It was not the first time Christopher tried to execute this plan. They invited Jose Pion, a convicted murderer, to the stand to share his side. Peon met Christopher in 1999. At the time, Christopher was desperate to exact revenge on his parents. He asked Peon if he knew any hitman that would kill his parents. Peon thought he was joking, but Chris reiterated that his parents were worth $500,000 and had life insurance. It was a juicy deal, but Peon backed out. Reacting to this statement, Christopher called Peon a liar. Prosecutors further proved their case by showing the jury a text Christopher sent to his girlfriend, Juliet. It read, "We're going to be better off after they're gone." As if like a dream, Christopher dropped his head and shed tears. He worried that the police were setting him up. He believed Juliet would never say that about him. Sadly, he was wrong because she was next to take the stand. Juliet told the jury about her boyfriend's perception of his mother. He called her a bitch at the slightest provocation and disliked her for not giving him everything he deserved. She recalled how angry he was about his time in Samoa and how the trauma never left him.
Whether they needed to pay for taking those years from his life.
Yes.
Again, Christopher's attorney countered the claims. He believes she was also threatened with the death penalty. Juliet ended by saying she never knew he would try to kill his parents. She believed it was all bluff. By now, John was convinced that his son was behind the shooting. He took the stand to nail him this last time. John described his son's insatiable desire for money. For someone who didn't have a job, he needed so much to fuel his lifestyle. When John was discharged, Christopher wanted to control his finances. He noticed something was fishy and kept certain details away from him. Unknown to him, he was saving himself from his killer son. Although John was convinced about his son's actions, he still couldn't believe it. He told the world at the hearing that he no longer loved his son. He officially distanced himself from Christopher and is now known as Melissa's father. Despite the mountain of evidence pointing to Christopher, he had to prove his innocence to the jury. It was the moment he had been waiting for.
That Juliet Driscoll lied when she said that things would be better when your parents were dead.
Absolute lie.
And when Juliet Driscoll told the police or testified that you wanted your parents dead, that was a lie.
Correct.
And that when Juliet Driscoll...
Christopher called his childhood friend an insatiable drug fiend. He claimed that Garrett broke into his home to steal marijuana. Earlier that day, Garrett asked him for drugs, but he refused. However, his friend knew where he hid those drugs. Garrett knew the house so well because he visited often. Christopher testified that the drugs were hidden in the closet of his old bedroom. It was the same room Susan occupied until the shooting. He claimed that the marijuana was worth $7,000. When Garrett broke into his home that night, he was shocked to see Susan in the room. Worst still, she was awake and recognized him. He was scared and shot her. The same fear prompted him to shoot John before fleeing the scene. Christopher insisted he was innocent and had no reason to kill his parents. In fact, he had healed from the torture in Samoa. In a shocking twist, he told the jury that Paradise Cove wasn't bad after all. He benefited so much from it. When asked about the maltreatment there, he broke down in tears, in contradiction to his earlier claims. His reaction proved that he hadn't healed from his experiences there. In her closing statement, Prosecutor Kathleen ended by calling Christopher a greedy, lazy, and entitled man. She urged the jury to look through the details and do the needful. After a day and a half of deliberations, Christopher Patrick Sutton was found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. On the other hand, Garrett pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. His father, Mitchell Kopp, was disappointed in his son. He'll spend nearly half his life behind bars over a silly decision. After Christopher's sentencing, John returned to his law firm while working on regaining his sight. He considered optic nerve regeneration at Scapin's Eye Research Institute in Massachusetts. He has now implanted a device around the back of his eye. While waiting for a permanent solution, he still practices law. Thanks to an aide, John memorizes his briefs and wins his cases like in the old times. He reportedly has a girlfriend who loves him unconditionally. John has still not forgiven Christopher for what he did to his family. He's now in his 70s and continues to practice law. His life is taking shape with each passing day. What could have been done to make Christopher a better person? Could this tragedy have been avoided? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
11-year-old Kiana Davis, 9-year-old Kiara Phillips, 7-year-old Carriel McDonald, and 5-year-old Keone Welch all died when this 2-story duplex went up in flames in arson.
A quiet town in Carroll County, Indiana, known as the Garden Sport of Indiana, was always peaceful until November 21, 2016, when a tragic fire claimed the lives of 4 young sisters. How did the fire start? Was it an accident? Or was it set intentionally? Today we'll uncover the details of this heartbreaking case. Galen Rose had just started a new job with higher pay and was excited. She dreamed of giving her daughters the best life she could. Her girls, Kiana Davis, Kiara Phillips, Carriel McDonald, and Keone Welch, were her world. At 11, 9, 7, and 5, the girls were full of positive energy. Galen dreamed of a life of endless possibilities for her daughters, one filled with opportunities she missed. Her childhood was boring, and she didn't want that for her girls. Her father, Tracy Rose, went to prison for drug crimes when she was only 12. She didn't have him around until 2011 when he came back into her life. Even so, this was not enough. Well, Tracy loved her and his grandchildren so much. He moved to Flora and urged Galen to go with him. She was reluctant at first, but had missed her father so much. After weeks of considering his offer, she followed her father to Flora with the girls. She believed Flora was a fresh start for her and her little girls. Galen and the girls lived with her father for 8 months until she secured a spacious apartment. She rented the 2-story duplex for $500 monthly. This was a breath of fresh air for her and the girls. The duplex had a front porch on a tree-lined street. They settled in so fast. The girls often played with each other outside. They were friendly to everyone and made new friends in the neighborhood. They played with a neighbor's dog since they didn't own one. The 4 sisters also loved to dance, play sports, and enjoy family time.
The sisters, who lived in Flora, loved to cheer. In this video, the eldest sister, Kiana, helps her 7-year-old sister, Carriel, work on their routine before a competition.
They were members of the Lafayette Diamonds cheer team. They had just competed in a cheerleading tournament the Saturday before the fire. And on Sunday, Kiana had a basketball game. Kiana loved basketball and dedicated many hours to it weekly. Tracy predicted she would be a basketball star. Like Galen, he went with her to games and cheered from the crowd. Galen was super proud of her girls. She worked long hours in a gas station. She even took extra shifts to make ends meet. Galen was calm and cheerful, like her daughters. She smiled behind the counter and spoke politely to customers. Her girls sometimes called her their coach because she supported them, especially during Tuesday cheer practices. Watching them perform was the highlight of her week. On the afternoon of November 21, 2016, Rose and her daughters headed to the grocery store. It was one of those exciting trips because the girls picked out their favorite snacks. When they got home, it was already evening. Rose cooked dinner, and after they ate, she sent them off to bed around 10 p.m. The girls echoed goodnight as they snuggled under their blankets. Rose responded and was grateful for her little family. The exhausted mom of 4 headed to her room. A few minutes later, there was pin-drop silence, with everyone fast asleep. No one could have guessed what would happen next. The Friday before the fire, Tracy prepared to leave town. He visited his granddaughters and asked them to help him pack for the trip. The girls, who called him Paw Paw, didn't want him to leave. They asked him to stay a while with them. It was unusual that they asked him to cancel his trip. But then, he didn't make much out of it. He left anyway. Hours later, he woke up to a call from Galen. She said his granddaughters were dead. How did it happen? Galen was fast asleep when she heard screams from her daughter's bedroom. It was a few minutes past 3 a.m. She woke up and immediately jumped from the bed. The flames were spreading fast as the screams continued from their bedroom upstairs. She tried to get to them, but the intense heat wouldn't let her. Smoke filled her lungs as the flames pushed her back from the staircase. She couldn't breathe or talk. At that moment, she realized rescuing them alone was impossible. She ran from the house to get help from neighbors. The first call to 911 came in at 3:30 a.m. While they waited, neighbors gathered around the house to help the 4 girls. Meanwhile, their injured mother watched helplessly. Neighbors rushed around the house, desperate to help, but it was too late. The screams grew fainter with each passing moment. Galen was later airlifted to Eskenazi's burn center. She suffered burns over her body and smoke in her throat. Carroll County Sheriff's Deputy Drew Yoder also suffered severe smoke inhalation. When he arrived, he briefly spoke with Galen.
Where is it? Stay up. They're upstairs? Hot. Yeah. County. Send Cutler Fire as well. Get Cutler Fire in route as well. Yeah. Where are the kids? Upstairs? Where's upstairs? Stay around the corner to the left. I can't get out.
He asked where the kids were, and she pointed to their room upstairs. Yoder immediately asked the county to send medics. Coughing heavily, he tried to make his way up a narrow, smoke-filled stairway. The girls shared a bedroom on the second floor. The climb was complicated and impossible. Galen desperately directed Yoder from outside. She urged him to keep climbing until he reached the girls' bedroom. Yoder inched closer, but the smoke overpowered him. Seconds later, he exited the building, breathing heavily and groaning. He raced to the Flora Fire Department, which was arriving. He yelled at them to get the fire equipment moving. Yoder was hopeful that the fire department would do its job. While the fire department inched closer, Deputy Yoder and Officer Dissinger wore air packs, getting ready to enter the house. They crawled on hands and knees to the front door. Unfortunately, the flames came towards the cops from the back of the house. Firefighters reached the officers and 3 of the girls and got them out. CPR began immediately on the girls, hoping to save them. The 4th girl was brought out of the house. Efforts to rescue her continued. While firefighters battled with the flames inside, the medical team tried to save the girls' lives outside. Unfortunately, all 4 sisters could not be revived. They died at the scene as the fire continued to rage through the home. Yoder and Dissinger sustained injuries and were airlifted to the hospital. Neighbors were shocked at how fast the flames engulfed the building. Flora, a town that is barely larger than a square mile, was thrown in grief, suspicion, and fear. Everyone wondered if the fire was intentionally set. Rumors swirled around town, and the investigation started immediately.
We're taking each one of those rooms and looking at those independently, taking a look at all possible causes.
The Indiana State Fire Marshal initially ruled the fire as undetermined. However, they determined that the fire started in the kitchen area. 2 months later, they changed the cause of the fire to arson after they found accelerants throughout the home.
I want publicity about this case because I want it to be solved.
Was ISP aware that that release was going out on Saturday?
We were not.
Investigators declined to talk about the type of accelerants found. Days later, the state police released a contradicting report, raising further questions. After further investigation, they discovered that accelerants were only found in one part of the house. This means that the fire started in one place. This conflicting information leaves doubts as to the real truth. A private investigator confirmed the fears of many in an email sent to state police. It read in part, "The press release statement about accelerants being discovered in several locations is absolutely not based on any evidence discovered at the scene during the investigation." And the investigator, Dennis Randall, was not performing a proper origin and cause investigation based on the current procedures of NFPA 921-2016 edition to opine that opinion. To add insult to injury, the Indiana Fire Marshal's fire investigator assigned to the Flora House fire resigned. Investigator Dennis Randall did not give a reason for quitting, but this move was fishy. Before his resignation, Josh Ayers was Randall's boss. Ayers was president of the Flora Town Council and Galen's landlord. The resignation is not good news for Galen and her family. They believed it would hamper the investigation. They have many questions left unanswered. Could Randa's resignation hurt the chances of locking up someone for arson? It would be difficult for a new investigator to take on the case with the same enthusiasm. Will the small-town politics hinder justice? The answer is not yet clear, but if Galen's suspicions are right, it would be another devastating blow to the case. Although arrests are yet to be made, the police say they're doing their best to get justice for the girls. The Indiana State Police Superintendent said they're focused on finding the arsonist. Doug Carter insists that the fire was intentionally set and someone who knew the family committed it. Carter also revealed that detectives have traveled to Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois, and California for investigation. He added that detectives are still speaking to anyone who visited the home before the fatal fire. It's been over 8 years since the incident, and there's no justice. This leaves much to be desired, considering that the Delphi murders were given more attention. Recall that Abby Williams and Libby German were killed on February 13, 2017. Shockingly, the police swung into action and arrested the suspect. Richard Allen has since been arrested and sentenced to 130 years in prison. Ironically, the arson case is far from being solved. Police say it is unfair to compare both cases. They say very little is known about the arson case, but with the homicide, they had over 80,000 tips. Is that the case? What if the police are hiding something? When journalists asked to speak with Deputy Yoder, the officer hospitalized after the fire, Carroll County Sheriff Toby Leesenby declined. Leesenby also refused an interview with Flora Fire Chief Todd Trent. When journalists reached out to the lead investigator, he declined comments. But then State Police Superintendent Doe Carter made a cryptic comment on the Flora investigation. He said, "There's a couple pieces that we need, and those that know what those pieces are know what I mean, so I'll leave it at that." Why are the police tight-lipped? Is there something they're not telling the public? While Flora residents await the police, rumors have swirled around town. Galen's involvement in the fire is at the top of the list. Did the girl's mother deliberately set the house ablaze? Here are the shocking facts. On July 19, 2019, the Indiana State Police wrote to Galen Rose. The letter expressed their desire to discuss the fire. As if that's not enough, they offered her immunity over her alleged illegal drug activity. It is unclear what her alleged drug use has to do with the investigation. Well, Galen admits to occasionally smoking marijuana. The letter further asks to speak with her to get more information about whom she commonly associated with. Although this letter was dated 5 years ago, investigators have not named her a suspect. She maintains her innocence. The police later expressed frustration over her lack of availability to speak to investigators. She spoke to them 3 weeks after the fire with nothing tangible to advance the case. When journalists tried to clarify the offer for immunity, the Carroll County Prosecutor's Office declined to comment. They would not speak to anyone until after the investigation. Investigators also have another reason to suspect Galen. According to documents submitted as part of the investigation, a policy was written on August 6, 2016, for the house the girls lived in. The policy had liability coverage for $392,882 and took effect on September 15th that year. A home appraisal dated September 10th was included in the documents. The home was appraised for $45,000. Policies are sometimes written based on a verbal conversation with the property owner. Subsequently, an insurer may physically look at the property. The timing of the policy and the fire raises serious red flags. Was this a case of insurance fraud? Was the policy created to cash in like a lottery ticket? As speculation continued, Galen added a twist to the case. On August 25, 2022, she filed a federal lawsuit against her landlord, Josh Ayers, his business partner, Troy Helderman, and their company, Birch Tree Holdings. The suit exposed a web of alleged misconduct.
It's been nearly 2 years since mother Galen Rose of Flora lost her 4 daughters in a house fire, and now she is suing her former landlord. Named in the case are landlord Josh Ayers, his business partner, and their company, Birch Tree Holdings.
Faith Alvarez, Galen's attorney, told the court that Indiana law requires functional smoke detectors to be installed outside each bedroom.
The smoke detector was right by their door, right up the stairs, right there. It was one there. Nothing on it. There was one in the kitchen.
However, when Galen rented the apartment, there weren't any. Earlier, she raised urgent concerns with her landlord about the faulty electrical outlets and the missing smoke detectors, but he did nothing to fix them. The complaint claims that firefighters found one smoke detector without batteries. The suit says Birch Tree Holdings and 2 landlords were responsible for the lack of working fire detectors. Galen hired Mike Vergon, a former ATF fire investigator, to solve the puzzle. He spent over 15 years as a certified investigator before starting his own company. Vergon visited the house 3 times in 6 months before releasing his report. He discovered one smoke detector with no battery in it. Determined to uncover the truth, Vergon raked through fire debris in the backyard but couldn't find additional smoke detectors. He paid extra attention to the kitchen connecting the back porch. He then examined the appliances in the kitchen. His findings were clear. It showed that an electric malfunction did not cause the fire. The most vital information in the fire investigation came from a witness. Adam Ayers was a neighbor and one of the first responders on the morning of the fire. He was there minutes before the police arrived. Atras told Vergon that he tried to reach the stairway to the bedroom where the 4 girls slept, but smoke drove him back. But before leaving the house, he saw a 2-inch wide path of flame from the back porch to the kitchen. He described this view in detail. Ayres was the only person who saw the ribbon of fire. He helped Vergon determine it was a set fire. However, Vergon admitted that the goal of the fire was not to hurt the children. After several back and forth, both parties reached an agreement on September 6, 2023. Jonathan Bont, Josh Ayers' attorney, confirmed that a settlement was reached. However, the details of this agreement are confidential. Both parties also agreed to pull down the building at 103 East Columbia Street, Flora. They had no objection to demolishing the damaged property. The day after the fire, Flora residents gathered for a prayer vigil at the church across the street from the home. After prayers, dozens of people dropped roses at the site of the fire. Their cheer team was also at the event. Team members lit candles in purple glitter outside the home in Flora. They also brought stuffed animals, balloons, and posters to honor the sisters. Cheerleading coach Allie Sheets accompanied her students to the vigil. She recalled that the girls never stopped smiling. She couldn't remember a time when they weren't cheerful. All 4 girls were always helpful, joyous, and respectful. Jen Brobst was at the vigil that night. She was a librarian at Carroll Elementary, where the girls attended school. She still can't believe that they're gone. She described the incident as surreal. Jen said the library turned into a counseling center days after they died. Her daughter, Liz Brubst, is a member of the Girl Scouts and Kayana's friend. She says she remembers Kayana for her happy spirit and positive attitude. Flora residents and neighbors also shared in their grief. For instance, Fox, their next-door neighbor, had problems breathing after the fire. Her husband had to call off work, and her brother fell sick. The 27-year-old woman who lived steps from the home was teary as she wondered what Galen was going through. Fox watched as smoke left the house. She heard the girls and their moms scream their lungs out. It was the most devastating thing she had heard. Fox and her husband rushed out of their apartment that night. They were confused at first, but then realized it was smoke. Then, suddenly, flames engulfed the home. The couple felt powerless. Her brother considered running into the home to help, but gave way to emergency personnel. Fox and her family cannot get over the tragic event that night. Cassandra Hammond was also affected by the incident. Her business is across the street from the fire outbreak. It remains a sad reminder of what the girls went through that night. Cassandra hopes the police find out the truth and that the girls will get justice. Another Flora resident, Eve Gibson, buried her face in her hands and cried her heart out. Speaking about the investigation, she said people in town were speculating who might have set the fire. She says a family member could have done it.
It's too small of a community. Somebody knows. And we're just praying every day that they get caught. If I'm dead and gone, I hope they get them, you know? But we're just going to keep praying for justice.
Flora community fear that the killer is in their midst. What if he targets another home in Floratown? The friendly community has commemorated the 6 girls with a bench engraved with their names and ages. Every year, they gather to place flowers on the home's porch in remembrance. Galen says she has been robbed as a mother. She can no longer take care of her children. She still calls on the public to help get justice for her babies.
Tonight, here's how you can help. A $5,000 reward is being offered for any information in connection with the deadly fire.
Authorities made a heartfelt plea to the community, urging them to provide crucial information that could bring suspects to book. They assured that callers would remain anonymous. Police are also offering a reward of up to $5,000 for information that leads to an arrest.
We need people to be talking to people, and people to be listening to other people and then reporting it appropriately.
Citizens can donate to the reward fund by sending a check to the Indiana Department of Homeland Security. To ensure this fund goes to the project, the memo line should read, Flora Fire Reward. Galen Rose has since moved to California to heal, but that doesn't mean the girls are forgotten. What do you think happened to the girls? A case of arson or an accident? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching,